Thank you for being on the call this evening. We have the pleasure of having Sister Margaret Taylor to present on governance, and as you will hear of Sister Margaret's varied experience, we really are very privileged to have her expertise this evening. So before I do introduce Sister Margaret and turn things over to her, I'd like to share a prayer from Come to the Table, which is a booklet that the prayers were created by mainly administrators, but administrators and teachers in the Mercy system. So this one is called Laborers in Your Vineyard. So as we are in God's presence, let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the privilege and opportunity to be among laborers in your vineyard. Catherine's legacy to us was rooted within the mission Jesus passed on to the church. As her followers, we pray for that same attentiveness to collaboration in our ministry of service. In so doing, we strive to share in the persistent commitment witnessed by Jesus and Catherine in reaching out to those in need wherever and however possible. Our desire is to embrace your call to serve in the ministry of governance among our sponsored works. This privilege to share in the responsibilities of influence and direction setting impels us to remain faithful to the teachings of Jesus and Catherine. We ask for your grace in naming the realities of our times, the wisdom to discern our participation in addressing these challenges, and the courage to embrace the Church's mission as imperative to our role as partners in carrying forth the vision of Jesus and of Catherine. Amen.
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 So Sister Margaret is a Sister of Mercy of the Americas who was appointed as the first Director of Sponsorship for the Mid-Atlantic community in 2007. She was previously Assistant Director of the Office for Community Development in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, where she was responsible for the development of housing for low-income families and the formation of strategic alliances to achieve physical and economic development in the distressed areas of Philadelphia. Her previous experiences include teaching and administration in elementary and secondary schools, the practice of law with the Philadelphia Legal Services Agency, and serving as Vice President of the Marion Regional Community of the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas. She has been a trustee and officer for numerous healthcare, education, and legal and social service organizations. Not sure why I'm echoing. Sorry. Including Project Home, the Philadelphia Association of Community Development Corporations, Catholic Healthcare East, Mercy Health System, and Gwynedd Mercy University. Sister Margaret holds a BA from Gwynedd Mercy University in Gwynedd Valley, Pennsylvania, an MA from Assumption College in Worcester, Mass., and a JD from Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C. And without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Sister Margaret. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Kim. I hope I'm clear enough in terms of my image, which you won't see much of because I will be using a PowerPoint presentation. But is the sound clear enough for you?
Can everyone hear? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, everybody else can hear me well enough? Okay, great. Okay.
Welcome, Laura.
Thank you. Let me tell you what I hope to accomplish, and then you can tell me if you have any other goals that you would like to accomplish. I want to, oh, there is Laura. Welcome, Laura.
Hi. Thank you.
I would like to go over the basic concept of what is a corporation, because what you're governing is a corporation, and some people just haven't ever thought about corporations, which is quite normal. So I'll talk about corporations, how they're organized, how Mercy corporations are organized, which has a few little twists to it. Then I'll go over some of the resources that I've become acquainted with over the years. There are numerous wonderful resources, and through MESA and through your own associations of schools and so forth, I'm sure you've become acquainted with a lot too. Then I would like to invite you to contribute too. This kind of thing obviously is a forum where you can share good advice with each other. So if you have things that you would like to say, I would certainly like to do that. Now, what I'm going to do is go into my PowerPoint presentation. I feel very much like a 20th century teacher because this is a very unnerving experience for me not to be in the same room with people and be able to interact with them. But I will do my best. Okay, so we will see. Okay, first, let me get it from the beginning. I did talk about what I hope to achieve today, and I hope by the end you're not as confused as this little guy who always reminds me of a very confused little person. I love to start presentations with him because it certainly indicates an inquiring attitude. Now, we're going to be talking about working with a board. And what is that all about? How many board members do we have? We have Bill, I know, as a board member. The others are administrators. Do we have any other board members?
I'm a board member.
Could I put our one board member then, if that's all we have on the spot? Bill, why were you willing to do this?
It was a commitment to the mission of Mary Mercy Academy.
Did you have
And
an
sister,
association
we
with
also
this?
have Denise Kruger, who's the chair of the board in Cincinnati.
Okay,
She's on
great.
by phone. So sorry, I was muted.
Okay, how about you, Denise? Why did you do it?
So if you're not familiar with Mercy McCauley High School in Cincinnati, the Sisters of Mercy closed Mercy High School and closed McCauley High School, and a year ago opened Mercy McCauley High School. I happened to be on the board prior, so one of the old boards, and was part of the transition to the new school, and felt that, so initially I wanted to be part of the board because I am a McCauley High School grad, and I wanted to give back, and I wanted Mercy education to continue.
Great.
I since have been on the transition committee, and so felt an obligation to continue the vision that the sisters had for this new school. So it's kind of a little different motivation now than the original.
Well, thank you very much for undertaking that. I was aware of the history of the Cincinnati school, so it's wonderful that there are people who are willing to pick it up in its new form and carry it forward into the future. And Bill, thank you too. It's a wonderful service to have people who are chairs and to have people on the board too. It's a great contribution to our mission because we need boards. Now, let me tell you a story about a board that I was on. I was on the board of Project Home, which is the premier homeless advocacy and provider in Philadelphia. And I was on the board 25 years ago when it was first starting. We were writing the bylaws. I was writing the bylaws. Mary Scullion and her partner, Joan McConnon, have received honorary degrees from every university in the Philadelphia area, et cetera. But at that time, we were sitting in a vacant church with holes in the roof and pigeons flying through as we were trying to conduct meetings and write the bylaws. And they were buying homes and beginning their operation of housing people. But they organized, because there are certainly advantages to becoming a corporation, one of which is you get a perpetual life, and they wanted to be able to establish their ministry in such a way that they had a perpetual life. And secondly, donations made to a corporation are tax deductible if they're made to a nonprofit corporation. So they had those strong incentives to incorporate, and they did. But they had a habit of really resisting having a board. So our board chair, who was the finance director at Bryn Mawr College, would begin meetings by, "What have you bought, Mary, that you haven't told us about?"
Yeah.
To get the meeting started. And we had one meeting that was fairly contentious, and they wanted to buy something. And we did not think they had the ability yet to do that, the capital yet to do that. And the board refused them permission to buy the thing. Afterwards, the vice president of Project Home came to me as a board member and said, "I think that was a disgrace, that board members get to tell us what to do. We're here every day. We see the needs. We know what we need. And I think it's outrageous that you tell us we can't do it." Okay. What's the point of a board, and what would be a response to that? Is it outrageous for a board to tell the administrators that they can't do something?
No, well, that's one of the important responsibilities of the board is financial sustainability and overseeing that.
Bill, are you trying to say something? You must be muted.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, yes. I thought
Yes.
Bill was trying to also say something.
Bill, go
boards-
ahead.
Yeah, what I said was that's one of the important responsibilities of a board is the, oversight of financial sustainability.
Right. It's the job of a board to think long-term, to think about not allowing the tyranny of present needs to absorb all of the resources that will be needed for the future. So there is a natural tension. People who work in the organization see it every day, and another potential conflict is they're salaried by the organization. Their jobs literally depend on how this thing is going. So there's a natural conflict, and the law has wisely put in place a group of people who take the long view and who govern the organization. So I'm not sure that Project Home ever exactly adjusted to that aspect of it, but they sure as heck know how to use their board. I went to their last fundraiser this year. It was actually their 30th anniversary, and they made $10 million at that event. So you know that they have definitely gotten themselves on the map. They don't meet anymore in churches where the pigeons are flying around, and they absolutely have changed the face of Philadelphia. Philadelphia has the best run homelessness prevention organizations in the country, and around the world they're recognized for that. So there is something to be said about a board that tries to guide you in the right place. A corporation, as I said, is a legal entity. It's chartered by the state. It's a state organization, and every state has corporate law. They have a special section for nonprofits, which is the state nonprofit corporation law. What does it mean to be nonprofit? Does it mean that you're going down the tubes imminently? You have to prove that you are a nonprofit in order to be in good standing. Has anyone thought about what that means? I will tell you. It means that no officer, director, or employee is picking up what would be known as the profits. So if I said to you, who owns General Electric, you would say the shareholders. The shareholders meet annually, they elect the board, and they expect to pick up the profits at the end of the year. A nonprofit does not distribute whatever it makes. It can salary the president if the president works for them full time, as many of our schools have a president or head of school who works for the organization. The person can be paid a salary. It's supposed to be a reasonable salary. Some nonprofits have gotten into grave difficulty, like United Way, when it's revealed that their president makes some extraordinary amount of money. It's considered unseemly generally for a nonprofit. So The regulation, and it is legally binding on a nonprofit, is that no officer, director, or employee will pick up what would normally be known as profits. Anything that is excess must go back into the organization. Kim, how can I get my image off? Oh, you know what? I don't need to do that. I have it on my own paper. I'm very challenged by this technology. Okay, so a corporation is chartered by the state. It is a legal entity. It is also distinct from those in control, so that no single person can speak for the board. The board speaks as a whole. The chair can speak on behalf of the decisions of the group, but the chair does not have any additional authority either, except what is assigned in the bylaws, which is generally about running the meetings. It's an artificial person, and it has rights and responsibilities. It can own property. It can make public statements. I think that the Supreme Court went overboard when they said that they have a First Amendment right to all kinds of speech. I think that went a little far, but they do have a lot of rights and responsibilities. A nonprofit has a lot of advantages from the government, such as not paying taxes, perhaps not paying property taxes in some jurisdictions, some kinds of postage rights, but they get that because they're considered to be good citizens. Nonprofits are supposed to be contributing something to the community in which they exist. And last but not least, they have perpetual existence. So this was particularly true of religious founders. They wanted some way to continue their work. And legally, the way to do that was to incorporate it. Then it continues. So perpetual existence is very attractive. Okay, I already said that. Now, when you look at the different kinds of nonprofit corporations, there are two kinds in terms of structure. One is a self-perpetuating board. So if you go to your local public library or United Way, they would have a board. And how do they get new board members? They recruit them. They go out to the community or tap somebody on the shoulder, or current board members go out and attempt to get new members. That is not how the membership corporation works. Membership corporations are favored in canon law because they accomplish something that canon law wants to accomplish. Your schools are part of the mission of the Catholic Church. They're a subdivision of the Sisters of Mercy, who are also a membership corporation within the Catholic Church. So canon law applies all over the world in different legal systems. And canon law says, use whatever legal devices you need to get done what you need to get done under canon law. So canon law wants to see some kind of a ministry, some kind of a structure, where the original owners, in this case, it would be the Sisters of Mercy, who are a recognized church entity, manage to maintain some kind of control. To do that, you establish a membership corporation, which means there are two tiers of governance. There are the members, who represent the original founders or owners, and they're the equivalent of shareholders in a for-profit corporation. So if I said to you, who owns General Electric, you would say the shareholders. If I said to you, who owns Marian Mercy Academy, it would be a more complicated answer, but in a real sense, the Sisters of Mercy have maintained a very strong role in it. And they've done that by the way in which they've set up the governance with the two tiers, so that you have the members, and the members, see if I have it on the next slide. No, I don't. The members maintain the right to do a couple significant things, and one of them is to appoint the board of directors or trustees. So in your case, it's not people go into the community and recruit somebody and just say to the board, we want this person, and that person's elected to the board. There's a process by which the members who represent the owners have to approve that person. In the case of your school, the Sisters of Mercy over time, if you think about the way in which our schools were established, probably everybody has the same kind of stories that the Sisters of Mercy of Philadelphia do. The Sisters of Mercy came to the city of Philadelphia on August 22nd, 1861. They opened a school a couple weeks later. And every group of Sisters of Mercy across the country has probably a similar story. It worked out of the basement or whatever. There was virtually no structure. There was no distinction between the Sisters of Mercy as a group and their school. Over time, schools got into their own buildings and had their own faculties, but in most cases, they were still not separately incorporated. I'll just take Philadelphia as an example, and I know this is true of New Jersey. The schools continued to operate as a subdivision of the Sisters of Mercy. Now, there are a few problems with that. By the time you get to the year 2000, which was when we decided we needed to make a change, what would be some of the problems of operating a school with the Sisters of Mercy leadership team effectively as its board of directors, because there wasn't any other organization? Can you think of any problems with that? You didn't have enough supper, probably. I'll tell you a couple problems. By 2000, certainly, and probably well before that, society had become highly, highly, highly litigious. So and of course, schools are kind of like a fertile field for lawsuits, as I'm sure, unfortunately, you know. So the whole idea of having the Sisters of Mercy be liable for the schools and the schools kind of cross liable for each other just no longer seemed like a good idea. So one way to contain liability was to separately incorporate the schools, and we went about doing that. The other real downside of that old homey system was the Sisters of Mercy leadership team was the board of directors. When I was on our leadership team through the 90s, we would meet with the school administrators every year and act as their board of directors and try our best to direct them. Well, the leadership team really has another primary responsibility. And in our case, being responsible for 6 schools was not really compatible with what else we were trying to do. So we needed the greater expertise and a wider group of people to serve as directors or trustees. So separately incorporating did those 2 major things for us. It enabled the schools to be their own entity, hold their own liability, and it enabled them to get a group of people to serve as their board of directors so that they could run their own operation much, much better. Now, jumping ahead, we had the Sisters of Mercy begin to conglomerate around the country. First, we had the Mid-Atlantic community and the Midwest and South Central and so forth. Then there were a bigger and bigger group of schools, and now we have completely consolidated. So the Institute has one large group of schools, and the Institute, the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, are now the single canonical sponsor. Well, as in our case, where running schools was just too much to put on our plate, the Institute leadership team felt the same way. And we could see this consolidation coming. So several years ago, we decided we needed to form an organization that would effectively take care of preserving the mission of the schools and overseeing them and acting as the representative of the Sisters of Mercy. And that organization is called MESA. So you have here a chart of MESA. And you probably are well aware of the people who are in it. It's a double layer nonprofit corporation. in that if you look at a school, the school would be at the bottom of that chart. And then your board of directors would be reporting to the Mercy System of the America Board of Directors. So that you probably are already somewhat familiar with this because you've been in operation now for how long, Kim? A year or two?
2.5.
Wow, longer
Yeah.
than I thought. Okay.
A little more than 2.5.
A little more than 2.5. So that there are, if you look at that beige colored block, that's the staff that helps out with the coordination and communication and providing resources. It's their job to continue what the Sisters of Mercy would have tried to provide in terms of education, mission training, and all that kind of thing. And they act as the liaison between the school and the Mercy System of the Americas Board of Directors, commonly known as MESA. And you can read the names. They try to have a wide variety of people who represent various backgrounds with our schools. Now, that organization, the Mercy System of the Americas, does not operate independently. That is a corporation, but in turn, it has members, and the members are the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, and the current leadership team is listed there. So that those people at the top have the ability to name the directors of the Mercy System of the Americas and generally oversee how MESA will work. MESA then is delegated to sort of say how the schools will work. Does everybody kind of understand that, or you've been around it or experienced it enough that you kind of have that down pat, or do you have any questions about it?
Got it. It's good.
Thanks. Okay, great. Okay, let's see. Once I was acting as a sponsor for one of our health systems, but it was for a Franciscan health system. And the group of us went to this hospital that was run by Franciscans, and we said, what do you think the job of sponsors is? And this older sister said, I think the job of sponsors is to encourage, celebrate, and challenge. I thought, great. I've actually never heard a better definition of sponsorship. So the job of MESA, representing the Sisters of Mercy, is to encourage, celebrate, and challenge. And hopefully they are doing that. The reserved powers of MESA are listed in your bylaws. So if you look at them, it will say the powers of MESA are the following. And it is, they get to do the typical things that members do. I always say there are lists of things that members have control over. Remember, members are the equivalent of owners. If you can control the 3 Ps, people, paper, and property, you've got it pretty well tied up. So in general, members retain some ability to name the board of directors and also possibly to approve the chief administrator. Obviously, the local group needs to decide who would be the best administrator, but generally in membership corporations, there may be some kind of a provision where the members need to then put a blessing on that or confirm it. Paper. The governing documents, the articles and bylaws are all very critical. If the board had the capacity to just change those, they could write the members right out of existence. So that the ability to maintain the documents as they are, if you want to change your bylaws, you have to get MESA's permission to do so. If you want to change the articles, certainly, because the articles are the things which are actually filed with the state that determine your purpose and state what your official purpose is. If the issue is big enough, MESA may not have the ability to say yes or no to it. For instance, for property, if you are going to sell the school or buy a school, it's going to cost you millions of dollars. That will even be beyond Mesa's capacity, and it will have to go to the members who are the leadership team, the Sisters of Mercy. One other thing to say about property is canon law has this fiction that all property is held, this part is not the fiction, all property is held in trust for the mission. Legally, in United States law, the school owns its property, it has its assets, it owns its investments, whatever. But under canon law, all of it is being held in trust for the mission. So that's why if you are going to do something remarkable in terms of affecting your property, you need to get permission from Mesa. Mesa may need to ask the Sisters of Mercy. And in our big ministries, like our universities or hospitals, if it's a giant amount of money or a big thing, then it even needs to go to Rome. And all of that is under this concept that property is held in trust for the mission. All of the church is working as a unified community to try to bring about the reign of God. And each piece is accountable to the church for executing its mission and fidelity. Any questions about that?
Question. I have a question about bylaws, and I don't know. So, Sister, I came on board as the head of school at Mercy Academy in Louisville just July 1. And so we are in the process of the executive committee, along with myself, going really through line by line of the bylaws, just doing a touch point to make sure we're compliant with the bylaws. And I'm wanting to verify that we have the most current set of bylaws. And I don't know, Kim, if there is some way to check that through the Mesa office, or, when the bylaws that Mesa would have developed were distributed, if it's just been 2 years ago.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and Sister Margaret was actually involved with that for some of our schools as well. When we began, all of the schools had their bylaws updated to, reflect Mesa as opposed to your regional community of the sisters. So, I'm very confident that if you have a 2017 issue, no, it's
not. And that's what I'm wondering, because as we were going through, it still says South Central Community.
Okay, and then that's not that's not the most updated. So I will look into that for you, Becky.
Thank you.
Yeah, Becky, it should, the part about the member and Mesa's authority over the school should be standard. And that's certainly what we think is in effect. And the lawyers that are working with us also think that is what is in effect. We don't particularly care whether there is a discrepancy between some boards have 15 people and some boards have 18 people. We don't care about that kind of thing. But we really do care about the people, the paper, the property, the authority, and who's ultimately running the show.
Absolutely. So thank you, Kim.
Also, if you go through your bylaws and there's something that was never written into it and it comes up as a question, I'll use as a for instance, can the board members expel a board member if they feel that person is harming the school or they don't want that person for some reason? You might not have that in your bylaws, but if you go to the state nonprofit corporation law for your state, it almost certainly will have that. So the backup is anything that is a blank in your school bylaws can be determined by the state bylaws, the nonprofit corporation bylaws. They'll have a model set there. By the shareholders or members, the Sisters of Mercy, holding regular meetings, actively directing the affairs of the corporation. The really important thing to say there is that the board only acts as a group. No person has more authority than another. The board must speak as a group. So if you're going to hire, investment agents or designate somebody who can buy cars for the school or something like that, you have to have a board resolution to do that. Individuals, with the possible exception of an officer, cannot generally do that. So bearing in mind that these people who spring up on boards, who think that they have the right to speak on behalf of the board or do on behalf of the board, they don't. Unless a resolution is executed naming somebody who's going to finish off some deal that you've begun, and this person is just authorized to finish it off, fine. But it is the board that has the authority. And they establish major policy. There's always a delicate dance between the administrator and the board over who does what, but I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I don't recommend that you read through the state nonprofit law unless you like to do that kind of thing, but it is interesting to people like me, but probably not to you. Read through your bylaws every so often because they do hold very interesting pieces of information that you can find that you're not following actually because you've just forgotten that that's in your bylaws. Besides that, there are legal requirements of board members. And these have been established over time by courts endlessly, and directors can be held to these standards. So you have a legal obligation of fiduciary obligations toward the organization on which board you sit. The first one is the duty of care. You must care for it. You must care for it as carefully as you would care for your own property. The business judgment standard is, I used as much care with the school as I would have with my own home, with my own salary, with whatever. You must act in the best interests of the corporation, not necessarily what's best for you, or, as we sometimes have in the case of directors who have children in the school, not necessarily establishing what's going to be the best team for my kids' talents, but what is in the best interest of the corporation. And good faith with what I know. Obviously, a board only knows what it is told for the most part, but boards should be active in finding out information. However, boards are entitled legally to rely on the statements of experts. So when your auditor comes in and does a presentation to the board, you are entitled as board members to rely on the auditors and what they say to you. If you're having some kind of a problem and you call in a building specialist because you're not sure whether this particular aspect of the building needs repair or is adequate or whatever, if you have engineers come in and look at it and give you a report, you are entitled to believe that report. But you don't just, assume things without taking care to find out what is going on in the school. The next duty is the duty of loyalty, which means that you are acting again in the best interests of the corporation, and this duty covers conflict of interest. I imagine that somewhere in your bylaws you have a conflict of interest statement. If not, you probably have in your policies a conflict of interest. There's certainly one required by state law. Does anybody know how you resolve conflict of interest? Suppose you have somebody on your board who runs a painting company and you need painting done in your school. And this person says, I'd like to do the painting in your school. What should you do? Should you say, no, no way?
Not necessarily.
No. What would you need to do, though, to make sure you're okay?
We would set up a competitive situation where you get multiple proposals and bids.
Right. Right. You have to find out what's the going rate here. What could different people do for you? What could different companies do for you? And then in a competitive bidding process, it might be that the board member is actually able to offer you a superior deal. Then you get that recorded in your minutes and so forth, and then you're okay. So you can do that to avoid a conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. When a conflict of interest situation comes up at a board meeting and it's not something where you're going to get a job from the school or whatever, a person who has a conflict of interest should say that to the board. I can't vote on this because it's a conflict of interest, and have that noted in the minutes for the board's protection and for the school's protection. The misconduct of another is a really tricky one, but you can't stand by under the duty of loyalty and watch somebody else that you know is harming the school. So you would have to do something about that. And confidentiality. When board members are appointed, hopefully there's some kind of an orientation for them, and their rights and their obligations are included in that training. Confidentiality is one of the things that is extremely important, and it's hard because people, especially if you have parents on a board, which I personally think is really a problem, they get pressured by other parents. What's going on in the board? I want you to present this. I want this to happen. And all of that is a tremendous problem. So confidentiality is important. The next one is the duty of obedience, which means fidelity to the mission. So I know one of the things that one of our schools talked about extensively was there's a big thing now to bring in particularly Chinese students. And Chinese students are rarely Catholic because that's not the predominant religion. So one of our principals raised the whole question, how many Chinese students could you take in and still be faithful to the mission of being a Catholic community or a Christian community, even in the case of the Chinese students? Or we have a school that's a vocational school, basically. And to maintain fidelity to that and not be pushed into something by competition. Whatever your mission is, there is a duty to follow that. It also requires fidelity to the law. So you are obligated to follow employment laws, fire laws, all that kind of thing, and fidelity to its own documents, which is why it's a good idea every so often to read your bylaws just to see what you've forgotten in the meantime.
Sister, I'd be curious how that, if you had any insight to how that conversation finished with particularly international students.
It was a balance question. You know, how much can you do without completely diluting your own identity? But questions like that come up all the time. When you say fidelity to the mission, everybody thinks, what's the problem there? Everybody's going to be faithful to the mission, but you can have things like that come up.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, how do you manage to meet the standards? Well, first of all, you have to attend meetings. When I see a board that can't, and I had a sister come to me just last week who said, I'm on this board. We never have a quorum, but we keep voting. Is that okay? No, it's not okay. If you don't have your board members showing up, you have a severe issue, either by phone or whatever, but they have to be there. So you have to really look into what the attendance issue is, if it's a problem. Ask questions. That's a major role for the board. Raising questions, even ones that people don't particularly want to answer. Ask for education as a new law comes up, a new law about, whatever in a school, a new educational requirement or whatever. If you feel you don't know enough about it, then the board can say to the administrator, but we have somebody who could give us a workshop on that. That would really be helpful to us. So anytime there's a major area that you feel you need more expertise in, it's the obligation of the school who's using your services to give you what you need to be able to do the job well. You can also request trade publications, conferences, board development. you probably get that kind of stuff. I know, the boards that I'm on, I do get that kind of stuff, but it's very helpful, and board members certainly have the right to ask for it. Administrators should alert board to new areas of concern. If there is, well, just take this coronavirus thing, whether you have a policy about what would happen if some kind of an epidemic were to break out in your metropolitan area, or what kind of internet policies you have. If there are new things that are coming up that schools get notice about, and they do frequently from agencies that you belong to or associations that you belong to, you should alert the board to areas of concern and make sure that they're on top of it too. Liability issues, and when people are sued, the school gets sued, the board gets sued, everybody gets sued. That's a basic legal principle. And the things that you get in real trouble for are acting contrary to laws or bylaws. So if there is fire safety standards and something goes wrong and you haven't been meeting those standards, you're going to be in real trouble. Employment issues are very difficult to handle. They're constantly shifting in terms of what courts are saying. So hiring, firing, discrimination, safe environment, all that kind of stuff, you really have to be on top of to stay out of hot water. Failing to act when danger is known is, of course, a major problem, because then you are highly negligent. Any questions about those? Protections for trustees. If you personally, now this would not be something that everybody would be into, but if the board is going in a direction that seems fine to them, but you really don't think it's a good idea, you can record your objection and have it noted in the record as your personal objection that you just don't agree with that course of action, if you feel that strongly about it. Every school, I assume, has directors and officers insurance. It's standard. When people are asked to join a board, they should ask if there is directors and officers insurance so that you would be covered. And then I've read our bylaws, and the bylaws also, and in every instance I can think of, guarantee indemnification, which means that in addition to the insurance, you also have a contract right against the school if there is some kind of obligation that you need to meet. Board responsibilities. These are the major challenges, and I'll go quickly over these because some of them, most of them, I think you would know. The governance challenges are the educational quality, financial stability, innovation, leadership relevance, changing environment for private education. Now, in some cases, who knows much more about that than you do as the board? The administrators. So the delicate dance between administrators and board members needs to be a respectful one, but ultimately the board is responsible for these things. Any question about any of those? So you need a strong partnership for success for the board and the head of schools. First of all, clear expectations, goal setting, and assessment. It's unfair to an administrator to try to evaluate him or her if you haven't made clear what your expectations are. A common sense of mission. Obviously, we try to ensure that as we recruit board members and as we recruit administrators. A shared vision. That can be a little trickier because schools are in so many different places. You have urban schools and rural schools and mixed schools in terms of coeducational, schools that are poor, schools that are more affluent. A common sense of mission is really important, and sometimes it takes a day of workshop or reflection, and there is a whole history too. The Sisters of Mercy certainly had a sense of mission for a school when it was established. But when you look at something like Cincinnati and you see that the circumstances are so changed, you need to develop a new sense of what the mission and vision is for today. That's responsible. That's not at all abandoning a mission. It's being responsible or how a mission can continue. A mutually agreed upon plan. I can't imagine that any of our schools do not have a strategic plan, whether they do it themselves or get some kind of expertise in to help with it. And committed to inclusion. Inclusion is an important value for the Sisters of Mercy, and it should be an important value for all youngsters as they're growing up and faculty members, so we want to be committed to inclusion. As far as mission, vision, and planning, you need to understand and endorse the school's Catholic mercy mission and identity. And of course, that gets to be tricky sometimes. Very complicated situations arise. You can read about them in the paper, and how to carefully preserve and help people understand the Catholic mercy mission and identity, and how you explain that to parents who want to differ with you or who want to have their children do something that you think is not compatible with the mission. Endorsing a vision statement is something that is important for both the board and the administrator to be involved in. Obviously, the mission is something that's a much deeper thing. It has a longer history. But where are we going right now? Given the circumstances of who our faculty is, who our students are, I really should have put them first. What kind of vision do we have for right now, what we're trying to do? And a campaign. There's always the need. None of our schools are so highly endowed or in such wonderful financial circumstances that they can do without raising money. So understanding, approving, supporting the strategic plan, ensuring funding for and implementation of the plan, and supporting comprehensive and capital campaigns is part of the board's responsibility. And any board member who isn't willing to chip in to the extent that the person can. Now, you all have sisters on your board who are not going to be chipping in thousands of dollars, but they hopefully can provide you with some kind of connection to people or their expertise, or they're helping out with training board members or something like that. For the educational quality, here again, you have an area where the people who are actually in the school are going to have much greater expertise. But the board is responsible for making sure that their expertise is current, that they are approving and monitoring educational vision and planning, so that, for instance, if our vocational school decides it's going to do something dramatically different, well, that's not really following our vision for that school. Program development and review, quality, staffing, enrollment, admissions, financial aid, student quality, learning outcomes, experience, encouraging new thinking. Did someone want to make a comment? I thought I heard a comment. And then monitoring the quality and outcomes of programs offered. A board should expect to see results in terms of, well, what do the standard tests look like? What kind of experiences are being offered to the students in terms with our mission? So that monitoring, not doing, is the role of the board here. Let me check my time, see where we are. Okay, the board has the responsibility of ensuring financial planning, making sure there's an adequacy of institutional resources, approving and monitoring financial planning, and thinking about capital needs and investment expenditures. Obviously, this requires a lot of skill and a delicate dance over what do you need now versus what do you need to think about for the years ahead. So the board has the primary responsibility for overseeing that and making sure that the administrator gets it done. The board needs to encourage cost-effective management, review, approve operating budgets, tuition and fees, risk management policies. Everybody should have in place, for instance, school safety, personal safety of students, because that is such a big thing today. Guiding asset allocation and spending rate of your investments, and supporting whatever kind of comprehensive campaign. All of that is a major role for the board, with the assistance and obviously a lot of footwork done by the administrator. For institutional governance, you need to ensure that the board governs and does not manage. When I first became a board member many, many years ago, there was a very wise attorney who was on all of our boards. And he said to me, the first rule is keep your nose in and your hands off. And that is essentially a wonderful description of what a board member needs to do. I also have a little book called View from the Balcony, and that is a good description too. The board establishes what it wants to happen. The administrator should have some leeway in determining how it's going to happen, how you're going to get to the finish line. So one of the things that sometimes causes tension in a board and the administrator is a lack of clarity over who gets to decide what. There are some things that are clear, and I've gone over that, the major decisions of the year. But in terms of institutional decisions, if something is going on, it's helpful if there's clear communication between the administrator and the board, the chair is the spokesperson, over here are the things that I'd like to feel I have the freedom to do if I'm the administrator, versus here are the things that I'm going to let you know this is happening, versus the board wants to have a hand in the decision or even make the decision. And having the ability to have clarity around that would be very helpful. Board Source publishes a book that is meant for a discussion between the chair and the administrator, in which it has a bunch of suggestions for how to handle things. Some meetings that you can have, some conversations that you can have, and it may help to clear the air or to create a good working relationship. But in any event, the board establishes clear charges and deadlines with clarity, respect, but they don't do the job. I have watched people step in, particularly in development, and step into what is the administrator's job, and it just winds up being a mess. And it affects relationships, which is the worst thing that can happen, actually. So what does success look like? Success, if you have the right composition of the board, and that's a skill in itself. It's helpful if the school has a grid in which you have desired things. I've seen grids where you have, somebody from the community, somebody from the religious organization, somebody from finance, somebody from community government, all of that kind of thing, and kind of map out who you have based on your strategic plan. What are you going to need? And then begin to fill your board with positions that are going to serve your strategic plan. The right focus, the board needs to be focused on the long-term stuff, not the nitty-gritty. Right relationships, if there is not a sense of community and mission, which is what we hope our schools are, communities and mission, then you're spinning your wheels. Right relationships are critical. And an ongoing process of discernment. Some questions are just not easily answered. It's very difficult sometimes when you have a student situation or a faculty situation. What's the right thing to do here? And to what extent does the board even get involved in it? But a careful process of discernment based on values that the Sisters of Mercy hold and that are legal, obviously, would be very important when you have situations like that. One of the things that a lot of study has been done on recently is what is the state of nonprofit boards? And it's not good. There is a sense that there's considerable opportunity for greater effectiveness, which means they're not great right now. Many are significantly suboptimized, and some are actually dysfunctional. So some studies have divided it into 4 categories. There are high-performing, exceptional boards. And you can think about whether the board that you're on now is that, or have you ever belonged on a board that is high-performing, exceptional. Then there are a category of sufficiently effective in necessary ways. Those 2 are in the minority in the overall study. The next category is no noticeable impact one way or the other. That's a big waste of time. And then the last is dysfunctional and damaging. So trying to get to be a high-performing, exceptional board, how do you even do that? Anybody have any idea how you do that? Well, I'll make some suggestions. First, it's essential that you have a governance committee. Somebody needs to be thinking about this stuff and thinking about it in a serious way. And it's ultimately the board's job to make it a high-performing board. So a governance committee should be tracking terms, conducting the assessment of skills that I talked about, ensuring diversity, and making sure that the people you are recruiting match your strategic plan. They recommend a slate of board candidates and officers to fulfill open positions. Conducting evaluations is extremely important. I'm on a board now of a university, and we never get out of a meeting without a 2-minute evaluation. It's just standard part of the meeting, and it's very helpful. Providing for ongoing development, a board needs education just as students need education. So looking at what are your weak points as a board and really taking the time for the board to evaluate itself annually and deciding where do we need improvement, and then figuring out how you can get that development, especially in mission.
Sister, when you said that you were in a board meeting that never got out without a 2-minute evaluation,
Yes.
of the meeting or how effective they were during their time, what were you referring to?
Of the meeting. Yeah, you would not have the time to, 2 minutes would not give you time for a broader evaluation than that. And it's things like the time was used efficiently. We accomplished this, an area where we fell short, whatever, but it was distributed before you got out of the room and you handed.
Thanks.
Yeah. Let me see what I'm doing here. I think I have misplaced some of my pages, but anyway, when things go wrong, the board chair really needs to take a strong hand and do it. Our meetings are contentious, strong people control the meeting. That's a problem. And a spirit of respect needs to exist in the boardroom. Discussion, yes. Difference of opinion, yes. But it's never helpful. And I've sat on boards where people feel that the way in which they show their expertise, this is particularly true of business people, like to just contradict people and grab the floor. So making sure that you evaluate the tenor of the meeting is extremely important too. And dealing with a contentious person is a skill that the chair needs to acquire. Then all we do is listen to reports. We never do anything. Making sure that you maximize your time at the board is important. I assume most of you use consent agendas. You don't want to read to people. You don't want to insult their intelligence. So providing the opportunity for people to walk in with the background that they need, but to engage in discussion and even setting up a way in which you ask people to consider all the pros of whatever is being proposed and then the cons, and get people to be the devil's advocate. so that you actually have an engaged meeting rather than listening to reports. Also, making sure that people are able to speak from a position of authority. When people say there's too much of this going on or there's too much of that going on, to the extent that you can actually do surveys and measure whether or not that's true. You know, if people say the employees all think this, the teachers don't agree with that. If you manage to get data where you can actually speak firsthand that is not true or that is true and we are going to do something about it. The major cures for keeping a board meeting on track is to have a strategic planning document. That gives you your blueprint. All you have to do is measure it out. And there are certain board meeting dates that reflect certain things. There's always a decision around tuition. There's always, well, you know what they are, but you space those out over the year. And so with your strategic planning document, you have the ability to put things into the agenda that move you forward. It's also interesting to think about what is the percentage of time that you spend reflecting on what has been versus what is versus what's coming up in the future. So I'll take finances, for example. When you have an audit, you're talking about what was, and that's important to do and to analyze. Or when you're talking about your spending rate or the finance report comes up, fine. But what about the future? Is there much time spent on that? Once in a while, looking at what's the percentage of time that's spent on past, present, and future in the various topics that you're considering would be a helpful thing. Good trustee orientation and an annual board retreat, I think, is a sine qua non of getting a sense of community, getting people to know each other. People need to interact in order to really do a good job, in my opinion. Having a head support and evaluation committee, that's a recommendation of governing school boards. I'm trying to think what group it is that does that. But they recommend it's not just a case of evaluating the head. That's important and it needs to be done fairly and ethically. But having a head support and evaluation committee, and they have a whole description of how to do that and what it would consist of. I talked about collecting data. Governance committee, it's critical to get an annual board evaluation, to get an individual to evaluate himself or herself. When someone's term is up, the chair should meet with the person and find out, do they want to continue? What have they found helpful? What have they not found helpful? Exit interviews if they want to leave. All of that is extremely important in making sure that you have a working board. Not just having a routine renewal of term, but actually meeting with somebody is very helpful. Governance versus management. One of the things that's interesting to think about it is the board has only one employee, and that's the head of school. The board and its members are not free to approach the development director without the consent, obviously, of the head. They're not free to work with the faculty or make comments, only through the head. The board has one employee. And the head of school has one employer, and that is the board as a whole, not the chair. Now, the chair is the spokesperson, but the chair is supposed to be relaying the sentiments of the entire board. And it's usually the chair, obviously, who sits down with the head of school and goes over whatever the employee-employer relationship is in any kind of evaluation that is done. There are numerous resources for evaluations of a head of school, and I hope you all have access to good material and can come up with a good way of establishing ahead of time what are the goals for the year and then how to evaluate success correctly. Committees help the board do its job, not the head's job. So you should not have a committee that you think is going to do something for the school directly. The board evaluates both itself and the head. One of the things that helps for clarity, and I said this earlier, is with administrators and board to avoid friction over what can I do and what do you want to be involved in. Having a sense of when the board wants to just tell us so that we don't hear it on the street. Or we would like input on that, please. When that topic comes up again, please ask us and get our input. You will still make the decision, but we'd like to have some input. Or it's our decision. You never should have decided that without getting our permission to do that. So getting some clarity around that. And as I said, there are resources for that. The Governing School Board's book of the handbook for the board chair and the head of school is helpful and things like that. Resources. Board source is good. Independent school management. Universities in our area have nonprofit centers, and I assume that that's true in your area too. I know on Long Island, Adelphi University was very helpful to one of our Long Island ministries in getting their board untangled from very, very bad history. They were able to do that. LaSalle University in Philadelphia has a nonprofit section, which is very helpful. South Central Community established a resource bank. They have little blurbs that come out once a week or so, and access can be granted to anybody. So if you don't get that, I would recommend that you talk with Jane Sprankle, who is the ministry director for South Central Community, and or Mesa could probably do it too. I assume it's available to everybody, but it's helpful. I noticed with BoardSource, I signed up for something called a brief something. It comes in almost daily, and it's a brief thing from BoardSource that's free, that just comes in. Blue Avocado is good. The local United Ways are good, and sometimes they're helpful in that not only do they provide governance help, but some of them actually run a program where they help match up young people who are looking to become board members and people who say to United Way, we're interested in being matched up. So they kind of act as a little matchmaker for agencies, because that's part of their concept of how to improve the community, train new board members and help nonprofits at the same time. I think this goes without saying, actually, that the exceptional board recognizes its long-term role, and it assesses the time spent on past, present, and future. It's actively engaged in thinking about the future. That's really the role of the board. These are some ways to make sure your board meetings are going as efficiently as possible. You can conduct post-meeting mini evaluations, which is what I talked about, the 2-minute, we did this right or did this wrong. Consent agendas for routine matters. Anything that can be summarized in minutes that go out ahead of time. And of course, board meeting materials need to go out in time for board members to really take a look at them. But if there is a sense that I get the material that is routine ahead of time, I read it. If I have a question, I'll be invited to ask a question. But we don't spend our time reading minutes at meetings. Sometimes people schedule one deep dive for the first meeting of the year or whatever, so that people get a chance to really engage one topic of value to them. When something goes wrong, if there's been some kind of a disaster that has happened, it's a help to evaluate it, to be able to discuss it. Now, you may need help in discussing it, some kind of a facilitator, but not just paving over something that has gone wrong would be helpful. Asking people to evaluate their performance every year and interviewing people who are up for renewal rather than just generally assuming they want to do it. Developing a board composition profile annually, reviewing it to make sure that you are going to be getting the people that you're going to need for this long-term view that you're trying to take. Make sure trustees are aware of their own attendance and events over the year. I am on a governance committee, I guess, or have been, and we get a map of who's attended what committee and so forth. Figure out some way in which people are certainly aware of their own attendance, and depending on how brave you are, you can publish it to the whole board. For big decisions, consider sequence voting. If you have if you have a big issue, you might want to spend a meeting gathering information, hearing people hash it out, giving people something to read, and not necessarily making the decision right at that meeting. It might be better to sequence it so that, we're going to build up to it. Now, the danger of that is you get groups building up too, who may begin to lobby for certain things, but it's considered a good practice. Assigning trustees to different roles, don't pigeonhole them. When you have a financial expert, the financial expert may also be great at planning the annual fundraiser. So trying to challenge people and have them assume different roles is helpful. Now here's where I break the whole thing apart. I read this wonderful article that was in Harvard Business Review, and it was by this executive dean at Yale University, and it was written after the great meltdown of the 90s and early 2000s. And it looked at companies like Enron and WorldCom, things that had fallen apart that were like pillars of the United States business industry. And they looked at them to see what had gone wrong. And it's the boards that are responsible for that. It's not the administrators, it's the boards. So they looked and they discovered the board showed up. That wasn't the issue, absentee boards. The directors had equity in the company. These were for profits. And the directors were still buying stock, even as the thing was going down the tubes. So it wasn't a lack of investment. They had audit committees, codes of ethics, compensation committees, all in place. The boards were not too big, not too small, not too young, not too old. All of the things that they thought would be the culprits were not it. What they discovered was it was not about any procedures or technical stuff. It was about human commitment. It was about establishing an atmosphere in which people would disagree and disagree heartily, but still be in communion with other people, a robust social system. So a couple of the really outstanding business people that they interviewed during the course of this study said that they considered their major role to be the person who disagreed. That's what they felt that they were hired to do as a board member, not because they wanted to just disagree, but because they wanted to present different opinions. So encouraging and allowing different opinions and having a robust social system, which is why you need some kind of social events, some kind of religious events, retreats where you pray together, where you develop a common bond, where you develop a net of interrelationships, where you really trust each other and really feel that you can go at it and then socialize afterwards. That actually turned out to be the secret sauce. The companies that really do well have a robust social system for their board. People who go at it, disagree, bring a variety of viewpoints, are not afraid to speak up, are not afraid to say the different thing, are not afraid to ask the unusual question. They are the people who make the great boards. And that, it turns out, according to the study, and I think there's something to be said for it, because we believe in our system of Catholic boards and the Sisters of Mercy boards, that what we're about is being a community in mission. And a community in mission means you have a relationship, but you have a mission too. And in service to that mission, you use your talents, your skills, your intellect to really question what's going on and how are we going to do it. Hey, anybody have any question about that? Nope. Okay.
Do you ever recommend your board to discuss norms for conversational norms and have some type of activity like that?
I think that can be very helpful. Usually people do that when things are going wrong. Yes, having people who talk about social dynamics and things can be very helpful. Yes. And there are resources for that too. There are we've used facilitators for boards that there are a number of ways of correcting things that are going wrong with boards. If someone is actively a problem, and we had one of our schools where somebody was actively a problem, and they would not ask this person to leave. They even renewed his term, which made me want to shoot myself because he was so abusive. And it took until the end, Kim knows this story, where his term was finally up. But in order to do a really important board meeting where we're electing a principal, we had to put into place extreme Robert's Rules of Order to keep this guy from taking over the whole discussion. So yeah, there are times when it's worthwhile going over parliamentary procedure, social dynamics. Again, what we're trying to do is create a community and mission here, not people who are going to argue. Any other question or comment?
So you mentioned the social aspect of a board.
Yes.
How do Mercy boards typically incorporate that social? Is it at the board meeting? Do they get together outside the board meeting? So what would be a way of incorporating that social aspect?
Usually, in my experience, boards build in time for a dinner before or afterwards, or a retreat day, or what are some of the other things that you folks have used?
Attending, fundraising events are, opportunities to mingle with other board members as well as other members in the community.
Mm-hmm.
The board could engage in they could engage in service together.
They could, right. When you attend things that Kim was mentioning, when you attend social events and things, it gives you the opportunity to meet the faculty and staff, which is also very helpful. If it is used properly, I mean, you want to know who the people are who are running the institution. You don't want to try to grab somebody's ear and do end runs around people. But establishing the social aspect of it is extremely important because it gives people then the ability to disagree without breaking a relationship.
If I may, I wanted to make a comment. What I've always felt was a good practice is having a board day at the school. Maybe a half a day where the board can visit and meet with different constituent groups. We did it at Waldron and even had like a social aspect to it with the faculty. And again, you don't want to get involved with operations, but you want the members of the community to know who the board is and vice versa. So it's just that little opportunity to learn a little bit more about the school and yet also build some of that social structure. Any other questions?